Lowe's knows how to freshen up your yard, and it all starts with mulch. That's why we're introducing Mulch Week during SpringFest with can't-miss savings. Right now, get 5 bags of Stay Green Premium Color 2 cubic foot mulch for only $10. Plus, members earn 5 times the points on select mulch purchases all week long. Lowe's, we help, you save. Valid through 4/9. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Points are awarded on eligible purchases. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change. Excludes Alaska and Hawaii.
Let's talk about the birds and the bees and the butterflies and the beetles. Nevada is one of America's most diverse states for insect life, but many of these species are at risk of extinction with no statewide protections. So today on CityCast Las Vegas, I'm talking to Amy Alonso, environmental reporter at the Nevada Independent. We discuss a proposal in the legislature to radically reclassify insects so they can be protected as imperiled wildlife, and why this bill has had trouble passing before. It's Tuesday, April 8th. I'm Sarah Lohman, and here's what Las Vegas is talking about. Amy, can you tell me why wildlife advocates in Nevada are trying to reclassify insects? Reclassify them as what?
Advocates are looking to reclassify insects as wildlife. And I think a lot of us have ideas of what wildlife is. You know, if you ask somebody to pick an animal that epitomizes wildlife to them, they're probably going to pick like a deer, a bear in southern Nevada, maybe a bighorn sheep.
Some big old mammal.
Yeah. The Department of Wildlife has a phrase for it I can't think of off the top of my head, but basically the cute, cuddly, fuzzy animals that we all had stuffed animals of as children. And I think when we start to move away from the classic cute fuzzy animals, most of us have a harder time picturing things like mollusks, snails, bees, beetles, things like that as wildlife. Like, I don't know about
I
you,
would
but
cuddle a mollusk.
I know. I didn't have a stuffed mollusk as a kid.
But I would have liked one.
Yeah, that would have been, a nice change from the standard teddy bear. But, a lot of other states categorize insects as wildlife, as do federal agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so why it matters in Nevada is if we don't categorize particularly terrestrial invertebrates or other insects as wildlife, is that without that classification, our State Department of Wildlife lacks management authority over those species. So this bill would authorize the Department of Wildlife to oversee insects, basically, but only certain ones.
Oh, God. So I was going to say, is it not just insects? It's like any invertebrate?
It's terrestrial invertebrates, which are land-dwelling, no backbones. That's my very basic rudimentary definition of it. I'm sure
that's helpful.
Science-y people would have a much better definition than I would. But
this is for everybody. We are sciencey people, and if there are more sciencey people out there, they can email us.
And then it only extends to certain of these types of insects that the Department of Wildlife has identified. So it does have a pretty narrow scope.
They're insects that are in need of protection. Is that the idea?
Yes. So the State Department of Wildlife does a wildlife action plan every decade or so. And in its most recent plan, the department added 66 different insects to that plan as being species of greatest conservation need. And so this bill would allow the department to have management authority just over those 66 species.
Amy, can you give me a couple examples of like, how many species did you say? 66?
It's 66, and they're primarily butterflies and bees.
Okay.
So some of the cuter insects that we do like. And then there's also one beetle. And so I think Southern Nevada residents may have inadvertently seen some of these at some point. One is the Mojave gypsum bee. And that bee is only known to live in the Lake Mead region on the Nevada and Arizona border. So that would be one example.
So this isn't the first time this bill was introduced. Why did it fail in the last legislative session?
There was a similar bill introduced last session by similar advocates. And I did not cover the legislature in detail last session, but I do know that the bill got stuck in a budget committee. And so that generally implies that funding was a component of the bill not passing.
Okay. What is the funding needed for these protections?
Basically, the Department of Wildlife would need to add a position to monitor these species. There's literally nobody in the state really tracking and managing these species. So we have groups such as the Xerces Society, which, are advocates for insects. They are partially behind this bill, but we don't have anyone out there day to day tracking populations, tracking habitat. And so Department of Wildlife would need to add a staff member for that. Within the Department of Wildlife, they basically have 13 biologists in their biodiversity division, and that would be the division that would oversee these insects. And so when you spread 13 people out over the state, that is a huge coverage area. And so they basically would need funding to hire somebody and then also cover, travel expenses and whatnot, because you wouldn't be hiring an insect person for each corner of the state. So that one person would be traveling around. Since the bill's been introduced, the Nevada Department of Transportation has also chimed in that they believe that they would need additional staffing as well, just because so many of their projects involve mitigating impacts to wildlife. So if we now had insects categorized as wildlife, they would also need an insect expert on their staff. So you are looking at, I believe the number was around $100,000 per year per staff member, if I'm remembering correctly.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I know that in any kind of building or infrastructure project in Nevada and in Southern California, you have to staff usually a desert wildlife biologist and sometimes an archaeologist as well. So this would add, I always confuse etymologists and entomologists. An entomologist? Yes, you'd have to add an entomologist to staff as well. That makes sense.
If you think you know everything there is to know about Las Vegas, well, think again. Duck Duck Shed is a 3-day festival where the city's true story comes to life. From April 24th through the 27th, the Neon Museum brings you exclusive tours, expert-led panels, and engaging conversations with the architects, designers, and storytellers who built and are still building Las Vegas into the entertainment capital of the world. Duck Duck Shed, it's a phrase from the seminal architecture book Learning from Las Vegas. I'm excited to have been invited to give a talk at the fest about how we do and don't continue to learn lessons about our city's unique design. So, whether you're an industry professional or just love the city, Duck Duck Shed offers a deeper look into our growth, culture, and history. Tickets are on sale now at duckduckshed.com. Register today and be part of this one-of-a-kind celebration of Las Vegas. Don't miss out.
I get so many headaches every month.
It could be chronic migraine, 15 or more headache days a month, each lasting 4 hours or more.
Botox, onabotulinum toxin A, prevents headaches in adults with chronic migraine. It's not for those who have 14 or fewer headache days a month. Prescription Botox is injected by your doctor. Effects of Botox may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away, as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness can be signs of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Side effects may include allergic reactions, neck and injection site pain, fatigue, and headache. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Don't receive Botox if there's a skin infection. Tell your doctor your medical history, muscle or nerve conditions, including ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis or Lambert-Eaton syndrome, and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects.
Why wait? Ask your doctor. Visit BotoxChronicMigraine.com or call 1-800-44-BOTOX to learn more.
So what effect would this bill have on our environment here in Nevada? Is the hope here that it's going to save these endangered insect species?
I think the intent is to protect the species before they are forced into a situation where federal agencies come in to have to list them on the endangered species list. So if you look at a lot of major projects that we've had in Nevada. I'm trying to think of some examples here. In northern Nevada, there's a proposed geothermal plant, and a butterfly was discovered living in the wetland where this geothermal plant would be. And so there's been legal action over that. The project is paused, and the butterfly is being considered for listing. When you head further south, I know this is not an insect, but we have, desert tortoise issues that hinder projects. And so I think when something becomes threatened enough that it's elevated to the Endangered Species Act, you run into a lot of legal hiccups with trying to develop projects. And so I think the goal is to get these species to a place where we have somebody who's monitoring them, where we have somebody who is an expert on them and has insight into their habitat, their populations, et cetera, so that when solar projects, geothermal projects, whatever's happening in our more rural parts of the state come forward, that there is a little more clear information kind of guiding the direction of these projects. So it's not like, oh my gosh, we just discovered this tiny insect that has a very narrow habitat and is right where we wanted to build this project. And so, yeah, I think the goal is to really get the management into the state's hands rather than waiting until it's an emergency worst case scenario and Fish and Wildlife Service is suddenly having to manage them as endangered species.
And for anyone listening who's thinking like, oh, how often would that happen? I'm going to spit some facts that you wrote back at you, Amy, and at everyone, because I didn't realize this. 68 of Nevada's insects are endemic to the state, meaning they can be only found here, nowhere else in the world. And that's a lot. We rank 8th in the nation for diversity of butterfly species alone. So the desert is a really diverse environment. And it seems like we have a lot of like microclimates and microenvironments, like the Amargosa Valley, for example, that have a ton of endemic species to them because of the uniqueness of that environment. You mentioned like solar projects and things, but let's talk housing for a moment. Could this create another barrier for the Bureau of Land Management to pass lands to the state or the city? Or is it more like you'd need another staffing member to do these housing projects?
I feel like this ultimately might seem like a hiccup. It might seem like an obstacle, but I really think that it does help streamline the process. If you have 100,000 acres in this latest land transfer and you know that an insect already lives in these 3 acres over here, like, to not touch that area. That's not the area to come in and scrape and build on. You keep your development on the other side rather than somebody coming in, going through, starting to issue, apply for permits, come up with plans. And then when you get to the environmental review process, suddenly somebody discovering a rare endemic insect or, something that needs protections in this corner and then halting the progress of the development. So I think it streamlines the process, but other people might have a different opinion.
I mean, do you have any insight on whether or not this bill is going to pass in this ledge session?
To me, it makes sense to allow our state's wildlife officials to oversee species that are at risk and have nobody else monitoring them. But I don't know. It's a tricky year with funding. It would require some staffing. So I think it could go either way. I know that I would like to see it pass just as a insect lover, but I should expand that to wildlife lover. But yeah, I think the Department of Wildlife does some really good work, and I think that it would be really helpful. I'm perpetually surprised at how many things in Nevada nobody is studying. I wrote a story a couple years ago, because we have native orchids in Nevada, which
What?
Yeah, like A, you don't think of because it's a desert, and B, I think we've all come home with or received as a gift an orchid from the grocery store that flowers and then like just sits there on the windowsill. And I was so fascinated. Yeah, and there's 2 ladies who are starting to study it, who I believe were affiliated with UNR or DRI. It's been a couple years since I wrote about it. But I was so interested because they were like, nobody has ever studied orchids really in Nevada. There's people who have observed them or reported them, but like nobody's sat and really studied them. And so I feel like some of these insects are kind of in the same category. Like we know they exist. Maybe we know what their habitat is, or we know what they eat, but we don't have like beyond the basic information on them. And so to me, that's really the strength of this bill, is taking really a deeper dive into things that we haven't had anyone looking at before. I have an email that I wish I could find. I don't know how to find it off the top of my head, but after I wrote about this bill, AB 85, I received an email from someone in the Pahrump area, and the email was basically, what a stupid story. Who cares about bugs? Everyone knows Nevada's a giant wasteland. And it kept going.
God,
and
people are so bored with their lives.
Yeah, and it really disappointed me, because I think there's so much to find out there. You know, you just have to have that natural curiosity or caring, and just taking the time to sit and really like see what the state has to offer. It's a different way of viewing where we live. And so, I really think the bill would be really beneficial, but I'm not a lawmaker. I'm not I'm not voting on it. And I'm also the one who would have to find money to fund the positions. So that's just my take.
Amy, for people that are listening to this and they're like, yeah, bugs, like that we want to support this bill. Like, is there a way for the average citizen to support this bill?
Well, as the bill goes through the legislative process, there's always the opportunity for public comment. So people have the opportunity to call in, go down to Carson City. There also is an opportunity to give comment in person in Las Vegas. Letters can be sent in, writing a letter, emailing your local lawmaker, and so senator, assembly person. So I think there's a lot of opportunities.
Well, you know what, Amy, if people listening do feel motivated to, push this bill through this time, we will link to where you can comment on the bill online, so where you can put your public comment. So, please take a moment to do that if you're feeling inspired.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
I gotta say, Amy, to bring it back around, at the top you made this great point. Like, yes, insects don't feel as cuddly as like a baby bobcat. And that is definitely like a more visible, like let's protect nature. But I always view insects as like the infrastructure of our entire environment. They're tiny, but what they do is so important in terms of pollination, in terms of being food sources for other animals, in terms of aeration of the soil. Like literally, if we lost them, everything would fall apart, our food systems, our environment. And you're right. It's so special. Our microenvironments are so special, and the animals that live in them are so fragile and beautiful. Like, I find that so exciting.
I also have just like a little story I want to share that
I
went
would love
with your
a little
little
story.
outro. Okay. Also love insects. I can't say that I know a ton about them, but the first thing I did when I moved into my house in 2017 was rip the lawn out because it's the desert, and tried to plant native plants. It's a mix. But
it's a learning curve, as I've found out myself.
Yeah, it's a mix of native plants and then things that have like symbolic significance or like happy memories for me. But last summer, there was just one day I went out there and there was just so many bees buzzing around in my front yard. And I just sat there for a really long time watching them. And I made like a little video, and a couple of them were doing little like romantic bee things, or at least that's what it looked like to me. And I was like sending texts to friends and I was like, look, and they're like, a plant. And I'm like, no, zoom in, there's bees. And so they play such an important role. And what you said about just ecosystems collapsing, like they really are the backbone of so much. We have thousands of plants in Nevada, thousands of species that rely on insects to pollinate them. Our crops rely on them for pollination. You know, I feel like in Nevada, like every year there's a story about the Mormon crickets up north that are gross and causing slick roadways and destroying crops, you know, and we have that. And then like every summer people go camping and they're like swatting at mosquitoes, and then like they'll come home and there's like the ant infestation in the kitchen. But like there's that, but then there's also just like this whole other world of like all these great things that insects do. And I have a 7-year-old stepdaughter, and I took her like kid hiking the other day and she was so terrified. We ran into a stink bug and she just lost her mind and she was so scared. And I was like, oh no, these are great. And like I sat there and looked up on my phone, like things that they do to help our environment and stuff. And she was still scared and teary. But like, I think just from trying to get people to appreciate the positives that insects do is just opposed to like, they make you itch when you go camping and they cause slick highways up north, to recognize that there's a lot of benefits, to me is really important.
Listen, fire ants are dicks, but they're invasive. So you're allowed to hate them. But as far as everybody else, as President Barack Obama once said, bees are cool. Bees are cool.
My neighbor actually lit his house on fire, burned his house down the other day, blowtorching a spider.
Oh my God. Leave this. Just ignore them. Just ignore them. So Amy, with the current political climate, as everybody calls it, how important is it to have state-level protections for the environment? And how strong is it possible to make those protections?
Well, I think that's a really tricky question in Nevada because the overwhelming majority of our state is federal land managed by federal agencies. So I think when we have the opportunity to retain management within the state, I think that that's a benefit for us. I think that's a lot easier when we have, you know, local boots on the ground overseeing something than a federal agency. And a lot of our federal agencies do have local and state offices. But again, sometimes decisions are made higher up the food chain. And again, I just think keeping it here is beneficial for the state. And that's an argument a lot of the advocates of the bill made as well.
Amy, thank you so much for your time and the reporting you're doing on this bill.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for focusing on it. Again, I think this is kind of a sleeper bill that isn't maybe as sexy as some of the other ones coming down the pipe, and maybe people don't see how it has an effect on their day-to-day life or why it should pass. But I think you touched on it, that insects really are the cornerstone of so much of our environment and, you know, pollination for food crops. And I just really think this is a really important bill. So thank you very much for talking about it.
That's all for today here on CityCast Las Vegas. If you enjoyed our show, send it to a friend. Tell them bees are cool. You can rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Take care. Do you have a favorite insect on the list?
I do not.
You love them all equally?
I don't. Yeah.
That's fine.